Gittin Daf Chafalef Amud Aleph, Autonomy and Belonging, Chatzer HaMahalechet. We're all somewhere on a spectrum of autonomy and belonging. Some people need a lot of autonomy and don't need as much belonging. Some people need a lot of belonging and they don't need as much autonomy. And most of us move around on that spectrum. There are times where we want to be very independent and autonomous, and there are times where we want to feel a sense of belonging and community and family. One comes at the expense of the other. The more autonomy you have, the less belonging you have. The more belonging you have, the less autonomy you have. But this idea of belonging and autonomy really affects ownership and ideas of ownership and degrees of ownership. And ownership is a function of kinyan. Kinyan is the way ownership is created, the way ownership is transferred, and Masechta Gittin deals a lot with kinyan, which we're going to use a lot when we get to Masechta Bava Metzia and we start dealing with business laws. A lot of the halachot in Bava Metzia come from discussions, including the one we have today in Masechta Gittin, because one can own with different degrees of autonomy and belonging as well. If you own a movable object, I own this watch, I can do what I want with it, I can move it, I can buy it, I can sell it, I can do anything with it. I have complete autonomy, it has no autonomy. It belongs entirely to me. If I own a piece of property, I have a little less autonomy. It's mine, and it doesn't have autonomy, but I can't move it wherever I want to. There's a limit to what I can do with it. And if I own an animal, then I have less autonomy, because not only can't I necessarily move the animal where I want it to, but the animal has autonomy to move where it wants to. And if I own a slave, then not only has the slave got autonomy of movement, but it's got autonomy of thought as well. It can think whatever it wants. It's got freedom of thought. And if I own an employee, not own, but if I employ somebody, it's even less so. I can't control their movement as much. I can't control their thinking. So there are different levels of ownership of kinyan that affect the object in different forms, in different ways, on the spectrum of autonomy and belonging. And with that kind of framework, we can get some insight into our Gemara. We have a kinyan. One of the ways to acquire something is called a kinyan chatzer. We'll see where that comes from, whereby placing something in your yard, in your house, you don't have to do anything more than that. That's already a kinyan. It's a passive kinyan. You, without having to do anything, the fact that it's in your yard or it's been placed in your yard gives you ownership of that particular object. That's considered a valid kinyan. Where does it come from? It actually comes from Gittin. Because in Gittin, we're given the posuk of v'chatav la'sefer kritut v'natan b'yada. It's interesting how many pages and pages and pages of Gemara are on this one posuk that we've had. Everything we've been learning so far has been on this one posuk. V'natan b'yada. And you'll put it into her hand. So the Gemara says further on in Gittin, we'll get to it. Hazorek get lishtovi betoch beita betoch hatzera rezu megureshet. If you throw a get into a woman's house and she's in the house, the get works. Minan imili, where does that come from? Says the Gemara, Tatan Rabban v'natan biyada. It says, and you shall give it into her hand. Why does it say into her hand? Why doesn't it say v'natan la? You will give it to her. Obviously, it's into her hand. So you see, ein li ela yada, gaga chatzere v'kafifa minayin. That extra word yada comes to teach us not only her hand, but her yard as well. V'natan mikol makom. As Rashi says, midoloktiv uviyada yitnenu. It doesn't say uviyada yitnenu, mashmalan netina kodu. Others learn it because of the word yada altogether is redundant. The Yerushalmi says, ein li ela biyada beginata b'chatzera minayin. How do we know that we can throw the get into her yard and that she's koneh the get, she's acquired it? She has to acquire it. It has to be a kinyan. V'natan biyada means the husband has to write a tangible letter. We've talked about that, a sefer kritut, and he has to transfer the ownership of that object, that thing, that sefer kritut. He's got to transfer the ownership of that object to her. And that's the view of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Shmuel says, Vayikach et kol atzor miyado v'adarnon. He took all of his land from his hand. Did he take it from his hand? So what does yad mean? Yad doesn't mean literally a hand. Yad means a place where you have control. Yad, your hand, is the tool you use to control, to manipulate the world around you. And so yad is where your authority reaches to, where your control reaches to. And your control reaches beyond your physical body. Your control you have control over your house. You have control over your property. And any area that you have control over is considered yado. That's one of the limudim that we learn. Now we get into our Gemara. Our Mishnah said a very strange thing. Our kol kotvin, you can write a get on anything. Al yad shel evet v'noten la evet. You can write the get on the hand of a slave and give her the slave, which is strange. We'll come to a little bit more understanding of that in a moment. Then the Gemara says, Katav la get unetano b'yad avdo. What happens if he didn't write it on the hand of the slave? He wrote it on a piece of parchment, as he should. And he gives it to his own slave. And then, Katav la shtar matana alav. He then writes a second document donating his slave to her. So now she acquires a slave, which is now her property, and in the slave's hand is a get. So is that a good kinyan chatzer? Is that like yad? Kanato umitgareshet bo. She acquires the slave and she is properly divorced. Ask the Gemara v'amai chatzer ma'alecheti. Here we come into a new idea with kinyan chatzer. A kinyan chatzer doesn't work if the chatzer is moving or movable. So the Gemara in Bava Metzia and Daf Tes, where a lot of the sugya resides, talks about an animal as a chatzer. You put something on the back of an ox, and you give the ox to the other person. Now the ox belongs to the other person. Have they also been koneh the things you put on the back of the ox, which is now kinyan chatzer? No, says the Gemara. That's a chatzer ma'alechet. That's a moving chatzer. Yes, that ox is like a chatzer. It's an extended part of the person's territory, but it can move, so it's not a good chatzer. It's a chatzer ma'alechet. So the slave here as well. How can you give this get to the slave and give the slave to the woman and say she's koneh? She's koneh. Yeah, kinyan chatzer, but it's a kinyan chatzer ma'alechet. That doesn't work. And if you want to say no, that he's standing still, he's not moving. But we've learned that even if it's, as long as it can move, it doesn't matter whether it is moving or not. If it is able to move, it's not a kinyan chatzer. So answers the Gemara, we're talking about a case where the slave is tied up. He does not have freedom of movement. So what we want to look at a little bit is this idea of a kinyan chatzer, number one. Number two, why is a kinyan chatzer ma'alechet not good? And number three, why is it good if the animal or the slave is tied up, then it is a good chatzer? And we're going to have a third idea, which is that not only, Tosfos raises it, not only must the animal be tied up, but the animal must also be asleep. Or the slave must also be asleep. Not the animal, the slave must also be asleep. Before that, just an important Rashbo. The Rashbo says, why does the Gemara not get into this conversation about the Mishnah? The Mishnah says you can write the get on the hand of the slave, and then you give her the slave. Why don't we then say, but the slave is a movable thing, a movable object? Why? How does that work? So answers the Rashbo, no. In that case, in the case of the Mishnah, this distinction is very important. In the case of the Mishnah, the slave is the parchment. He's not a chatzer. You're not giving a get to the slave and the slave to the woman. The slave is the get. Now you're giving the slave to the woman. That's giving the get to the woman. The slave is the get. That's a different case. Here we're talking about there's a physical get. There's a piece of parchment. You've put it in the slave's hand. Now you want to give her the parchment by giving her the slave. And use kinyan chatzer, using the territorial kinyan. But the territorial kinyan only works with territory that is stable, not with territory that moves. The Mitzvah talks not only about an animal, about a ship. Is a ship, if you own a boat and fish jump into the boat, are they now yours because it's a kinyan chatzer, but the ship's movable? A woman who carries a basket on her head. Like in Africa, the women walk around with baskets on their head. That's how they carry heavy weights. What happens if you throw the get into the basket on her head? Is that a chatzer ma'alechet or not? So there's a whole sugya there around a chatzer ma'alechet. How does that work? Says Tosfos, it's not good enough that it's a chatzer ma'alechet. It also has to be that it's not ma'alechet. It must be kapot ve'yashen ba'inan, and asleep. And v'chein pasku halachas gedolos. The Baal halachas gedolos, you'll remember, is that very important, very early halachic work written in the time of the Geonim, which you see how Tosfos, and we'll see that Rashbo attribute enormous authority to the Baal halachot gedolot. And the Baal halachot gedolot says you need these two requirements. Why? Explains the Rashbo. In the case of a behema, in the case of an animal, you don't need the animal to be asleep. We need what the Gemara calls a chatzer mishtameret. A chatzer mishtameret ledaat bala. That means that the chatzer is governed by the intention of the owner. So this is a very important principle in life and in the Matmonim that we're discussing today. Territory can be governed by the values and the daat of the owner. You govern your house with your values. And that's the whole idea of a home. That no matter what's going outside your home, in your home it's your values. And that's why you can make certain conditions. Believe it or not, you can even make conditions for your own children and tell them how to behave in your home. It's okay to do that. Your home is a place where you set the values. You can't control the values outside, but in your home you can control the values. Somebody comes into your home, they feel your values. And that's called mishtameret ledat habalim. The owner has not only physical authority over the space, but also mental and moral authority over the space the owner has. That's part of what a chatzer is. That's part of what your own territory is. That's why Reshut HaYachid extends beyond yourself. Reshut HaYachid is your private domain. Your private domain extends to your house. It extends to your yard. If it's mishtameret, if there's a fence around your yard, it's defined, and you control the values that govern that yard, then that's a Reshut HaYachid. It's part of your own private territory. And that's where a kinyan chatzer can work. It has to be mishtameret adat ba'alim. If an animal is tied up, it's not mahalechet, the animal can't move, so that's good. And it's mishtameret adat ba'ala. It's governed by what the owner wants to do with it. The owner can do with the animal. Owner wants to slaughter the animal. Animal's already tied up. He can be a chalif and he can slaughter the animal. The owner has complete authority, complete autonomy. The animal has no autonomy. When it's bound up, the animal is completely into belonging with zero autonomy. 100% belonging, zero autonomy. That's an animal that's tied up. But what about a slave that's tied up? Says the Rashba, that's different. Because a slave, even if he's tied up, is free to think. You can't control his thoughts. And therefore your ownership of the slave is limited. And the only time you own him is if he's tied up and he's asleep. Now he's not a mehalechid, he can't move, and he's mishtameret ledat ba'ala because he hasn't got freedom of thought. He can't think whatever he wants to do. Then it's okay. So the Rashba, like Tosfos, comes to the conclusion, unlike the Rambam, that in this case it's not sufficient to have him bound up. He must also be asleep, so that it's not only a chatzer she'eina mehalechid, it's not only a non-moving yard, chatzer, piece of territory, but it's also a piece of territory over which you have mental control, not only physical control. And Rashba also says that that's how the Bahag paskins. And that's a very important thing to understand in the way we relate to the things we control, so to say, whether it's our territory. So if it's an inanimate object, as we said, easy, we control it completely. If it's an animate object, no, there are limits on our control. Now you get into the area of people, and this is the whole issue that's going on in the world at the moment about people coming back to the office or not, and bosses saying, I want the people back in the office, I control. This is my territory, you work for me, I tell you where you are. No, yes, but they're saying we have freedom of movement. We learned during COVID that we have freedom of movement. You don't own our rights to move and to be where we want as long as we're doing the work. They want autonomy. The balabos wants more belonging and less autonomy. How do I build a business if nobody belongs in the culture, if nobody belongs to the team? That's the debate that's taking place on a deeper level. It's not just about do I work from home or don't I, do I work remotely or don't I. It's about belonging and autonomy. How much belonging, how much autonomy do we have? And in our own homes, it's an important thing too. Yes, I can control access to my home. I can control who comes in and out of my home. Is that sufficient? It has to be mishtameret ledat ba'ala. I also have the capacity to control the value systems that govern my home. Am I doing that effectively? Am I doing that properly? And when it comes to children, I can govern my children's movements up to a certain age, maybe. Can I really govern what they're thinking and what they're not thinking? So what kind of ownership do I have? I don't have ownership. Even a slave who's bound up, who's chained, I don't have total autonomy and ownership over such a slave because he still has freedom of thought. And that freedom of thought gives him a level of autonomy that diminishes my ownership and my control over him. I'm not 100% on the autonomy side, I'm not totally on the belonging side, but I'm somewhere in between. And using this framework will help us understand the laws of kinyanim, will help us understand the principles of ownership, but also in life and in business and in leadership, helps us understand and consider how we view the things we, so to say, control, the things that we can influence. Always consider it on the level of belonging and autonomy. How much belonging does that person, to what extent does that person or thing or space or business belong to me? And to what extent does it have its own autonomy? Is it able to be autonomous within its own right? Just understanding things in that framework will help a lot. And once again, as I said last time, Take a few moments, even if it's just a few moments in the afternoon in your mind, to quickly review some of the key points of the shiur. Or take the Makoros and run through the Makoros again and have them look inside. Do something to embed these pieces of learning. There's just these wonderful ideas we pull out of the Gemara every day. Do something to keep them inside you, to make them part of you, and act on them. Start using it. Start using the framework. Start noticing. Start noticing your language. Start noticing the way you manage people. Start noticing the way you interact with people. Where are you on the spectrum of autonomy and belonging?